All right, we're live. Give it a second to load up on YouTube. All right, we're good. All right, yeah, we're live now. So, what's up, everyone? Welcome to a debate between me and Ben versus Matt and Eddie. The debate topic is economics and ethics of communism versus capitalism. Me and Ben will be arguing in favor of capitalism, and Matt and Eddie will be arguing in favor of communism. Should be a great debate. Thank you all for coming, and we'll get into opening statements. I don't really care who goes first.
Or you want me to go first?
Go for it.
Sure.
All right. All right. So I apologize. This is a little long, and also, I have trouble reading long things out loud sometimes. So just bear with me on this. All right. So I'm starting with the ethics opening statement. Logic is completely objective. There's no my logic or your logic. There's just logic. So if you have a logical position, then it's an objective argument that stems from first principles. First principles are foundational propositions and axioms that do not have to be defended. A few examples of first principles are as follows. Number one, the principle of non-contradiction. This first principle is a foundational principle of all logic and reason. Something cannot be A and not A at the same time. Also, if something is A, it cannot be B if A and B are mutually exclusive. It may be possible for something that is A to turn into B, but once it does, it cannot be A anymore. Directly from this, we get number two, the consistency principle. In logic, consistency means that there aren't any contradictions. So as long as the principle of non-contradiction holds, the consistency principle does as well. While there are proofs of consistency for purposes here, we'll just look at falsifiability. If we can find an inconsistency in a posit, then the posit must be rejected. If A and B are mutually exclusive and a true dichotomy, then falsifying A is all you need to do to support B and vice versa. It's a consistency principle that leads us to establish burden of proof. Number three, burden of proof is on the active side, not the passive side. There are a lot of things you are not doing right now. There are an infinity of things you are not doing right now. Imagine if someone said you had to justify every single one of them. There's no way you could do it. It would be inconsistent for someone to insist that you had to justify one or some of the things you are not doing, since you can't possibly justify them all. The only principle consistent with the consistency principle is that you are not doing something. You don't have to justify it to anybody. The burden of proof is never on the passive side, which means the burden of proof must be on the active side when the active side conflicts with the passive side. Everything so far is absolutely consistent with established logic, and you cannot doubt any of this without running afoul of the basic principles of logic and rational thought. They are the basis of all science and reason. Now, going from nothing more than these first principles, let's see how it works in the libertarian versus statist debate. Number four, force is active. Ergo, those who want to use force have the burden of proof. Those who do not have no such burden at all. There's no way around this. If someone's just sitting there not doing anything, the burden of proof is on you to justify any action taken against them. Like, let's say taking some money. And you can't worm your way out of this by just calling yourself a government. That is a blatant violation of the consistency principle. You can't have different rules for government that you do for the rest of us. Even if the person is taking an action, if everyone affected by the action agrees to it, the burden of proof is on you if you want to interfere. So if one person hires another person and that person agrees to work for wages of $7 an hour and you think that's too low, and that it should be $15 an hour, the burden of proof is on you to justify your intrusion into this voluntary, private, peaceful exchange. Number five, the initiation of force cannot be defended. Person A hires person B at $7 an hour. Person C, thinking person B should be paid at least $10 an hour, wants to point a gun at person A and make him pay person B more money. Is he justified in this? Think about it. If person A then points a gun back at person C, because he doesn't want to be forced to do something he doesn't want to do, what's person C going to do? Say that person A doesn't get to use force, even though person C is doing what he's doing through force? How does person C have any legitimacy here at this point? And it gets worse. Let's say if person D disagrees with person C's interference and points a gun at him. If the initiation of force is defensible, then who's acting in the wrong here? The only way compatible with the consistency principle is that the initiation of force is never justified, which means that the non-initiation of force principle, also known as the non-aggression principle, the basis for all libertarianism, is the only principle compatible with consistent logic. And since this argument was made in an unbroken chain from the first principles, you cannot refute it. Your only recourse is to try to find a flaw in my logic up to this point, some link in the chain that was skipped or doesn't work for some reason. That's the only option open to you if you want to deny the non-aggression principle. Number 6, self-ownership. It's now time to turn for the basis of all libertarian political policy, property rights. While non-initiation of force is the guiding principle of property rights, is the logical structure we use to determine who is initiating force and when. This isn't a pragmatic idea. It too is based on first principles. We start with the principle of self-ownership. Basically, you own yourself, you own your body, your time, your mind, and the fruits of your labor. Why? Well, what would it mean if you didn't? Who else would own you? If someone else can own you, that would make you their slave. But slavery completely violates the consistency principle. Who gets to own slaves and who is subject to being enslaved? You would be making different rules for different people, which you don't get to do. The mere fact that an individual argues presupposes that he owns himself and has a right to his own life and property. If there's a dispute over your body, say someone wants to rape you or enslave you, then either they are willing to try to justify it or not. If not, then they are criminals and you have to deal with them with force or whatever. If they try to justify, then they have to do so in a peaceful context. And remember, all justification is necessarily argumentative justification. That means any conceivable justification, that is, any possible norm that could conceivably be justified, has to be compatible with the norms of argumentation. And those include peace, the presumption that there is value to cooperation, the presumption that it is desirable that people have the ability to control their own bodies. Not only to argue during this argument. Sorry, at this part, I think I missed a sentence. My bad. Hold on one second. Not only to argue during the argument, but to have survived in the world to the point of making argument, which requires the use of scarce means, etc. The point is that you can never justify a socialist or criminal ethic. How could you do so? You would have to make an argument in the course of peaceful argumentation that peace is bad. This cannot be done. It is a contradiction. So if you want to commit aggression, you either have to just do it and give up the idea that you can justify it, or you can try to justify it. You have to recognize that it cannot be done. By examining the structure of this from the outside, we can recognize that no socialist ethic can ever in practice be argumentatively justified. And to say you do not own yourself outside of an argument is simply to say some form of socialism is justified. How can two supposedly civilized, mutually rights-respecting, peace-desiring people ever argue that it is okay to hit people who have done nothing wrong? If you make this argument, then you have no grounds for refusing to coerce the other guy into accepting your argument, which is contrary to the nature of argumentation, which presupposes that each side has the right to disagree with the other and is not being coerced. And that's it.
All right. So Matt, do you just read your statement next, or do we respond to that, or what?
Read your statement, then we'll go into like a back and forth.
Sounds good. So I'll read the ethics of socialism argument that I created. So basically, I want to start off by saying socialism has been misconstrued throughout history. It is often conflated with things like authoritarianism, big government, and the loss of freedom. Very simply, however, socialism is the expansion of democracy to more areas of life, from your workplace to your community, to your local and state governments, and even the country as a whole. Socialism seeks to work in the interest of the majority of the workforce, the workers, as opposed to working in the interest of the few in the owning class, which is the primary goal of capitalism. Currently, capitalists make up a smaller part of the workforce, but have far greater power. We as socialists want to direct power back to the hands of the workers by giving workers a say in how the company they work for is run, have a say in the working conditions, how the profits created largely by the workers gets distributed, and above all, how to protect every person's basic human needs. Capitalists believe that every exchange should be voluntary, free from coercion, but they neglect the fact that all the power is in the capitalist's hands, and there isn't really a voluntary exchange between the worker and the capitalist with this unequal balance of power. Capitalists also believe that once workers sign a contract to work, they have to consent to everything that goes on, and if they don't like their job, they can leave. But this leaves the problem of the worker just to go be exploited by another capitalist. Free market capitalism reinforces the power already in the hands of the capitalists in our society today. Capitalists have an affinity to protect private property rights, but these rights only benefit those with property. Socialists aren't coming to take your toothbrush, your car, your house, or even your small business to an extent, because this is what we consider personal property and something that a person has absolutely every right to. However, private property is that property which is controlled by a few or one owner that requires the labor of others to generate a profit. Examples of this include owning multiple homes as a landlord in order to extract rent from your tenants, owning warehouses or factories in which laborers work hard in hard conditions, which they have little to no say in their treatment, and even natural resources like private gas and oil companies. If you think about it, it's really weird where people own multiple homes while there's over 500,000 people who are homeless. And capitalism also doesn't allow for the exchange of goods so that everybody can have something. For instance, we have 17 million homes that are currently empty and still have over 500,000 people that are homeless. It's also strange that one person or company can own a natural resource that comes from the land, that is, comes from the land. It's natural. So we should all, as a country, have a say in what happens with these natural resources. We should nationalize our industries, starting with the energy sector, so the oil and gas, and then have the citizens enjoy the profits and the fruits of the country in which we live. Capitalism seeks no justice or reparations for the countless marginalized groups that have already been left out of our economy. Capitalists want to get rid of welfare programs, which would harm countless people, especially lower income people who are disproportionately people of color and these marginalized groups. Another group that would be hurt by this are disabled people who, on top of not necessarily being able to provide a lot of value to a company and are hired at lower rates, it would cut over 10 million people off of their primary source of income, Social Security disability. Now, this hardly touches on the other ethical problems of capitalism, from the unequal exchange of goods that leave some with too much and some with too little, like in sectors like food or housing. This also doesn't touch on capitalism's horrible record when it comes to imperialism, which I'm sure we'll get into later tonight.
That's it. Now we can go into back and forth. I have some contentions with your opening statement, and mainly in the power structure that you're operating based on like capitalists, so-called capitalists compared to the working class. If like analyzing that, so you guys in your opening statement made the proposition that under capitalism, all the capitalists have power and the workers don't. So you guys say we ought to have the workers own. Have more power in that. So how do you normatively justify that claim?
That was it. So I guess the reason that I believe that capitalists have too much power, again, you say that there's a voluntary exchange going on, but the alternative to working in a capitalist society is death or starvation or other bad, I guess, realities. And so you're either forced to work or, starve, essentially.
I can. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you can go, Eddie.
Okay, so the capitalist ownership of the means of production and their ownership of private property is reinforced by the state. So Ben said you can't justify violence, but violence has been used for years in order to maintain the capitalist mode of production. So as capitalism develops and as wealth inequality grows and these companies start to monopolize, they also become tied in closer and closer with the state. And as we've seen the development of capitalism for, however many years now, we've gotten to the point where in the US, where basically every member of the State Department is a weapons manufacturer. So you're seeing, incredibly close ties between private industry and what's supposed to be public, what's supposed to be the government, because the state is not actually a mediator between the classes. It is for the maintenance of the system. So in the 1940s, you had the largest wildcat strikes in history, right? This is workers rising up and demanding different wages. And this is when you start to see union busting laws and right to work laws implemented, which, for the last 40 years under Reagan have gotten even worse. Because when you allow capitalists to own the means of production, they're essentially going to be what Marx said, warring tribes between each other. And I'm kind of giving away part of what my opening statement is here, so I don't want to go for too long. But my basic point is that without the state itself, this institution, the government, which has a monopoly on violence and exists above society, you wouldn't have capitalism at all, because the classes would have gone to war with each other and we would have had socialism already. They need the capitalists to, one, bust unions and bust strikes, and two, go around the world and do warfare and CIA coups on any proletarian movements who attempt to develop an alternative system to capitalism.
All right, so I have many contentions with that. We'll go across the line. The first thing I want to talk about is the voluntary versus involuntary nature of labor under capitalism. So you say if you don't work, you die. But this is the worker-die dichotomy. But the problem here is that in order to be forced, it requires an enforcer. So which individual is acting to force you to work under capitalism? Because under a capitalist system, or let me phrase that, under my ideal capitalist system, which would be a capitalist system without a state, the workers are free. Workers and overall citizens are free to go work for whomever they want. It doesn't matter if there's a worker-die economy which you're presenting, but there's still no one forcing them to work as a direct action. Because forcing requires action.
Can I go, or do you want to go, or are we going across the board?
Whoever out of you two can go.
Yeah, I just don't understand how you're going to create capitalism without a state. Because like I said, I mean, the way Marx and Lenin conceptualize this is you either have dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or you have dictatorship of the proletariat, because there's no, kind of capitalism that just exists where everybody's happy and there's free exchange, and no capitalists meet up with the bankers and say, hey, let's form a cartel or a monopoly and dominate this market. If we didn't have the state to enforce union busting laws and to crush every proletarian movement that's risen out of the global South in the past few years, they would have already established socialism. And in Britain in the 1800s, they developed capitalism and they developed this industry and they developed banks without this giant state bureaucracy and without this giant military. But then as the country started going to war and doing these imperialism in the global South, which eventually would lead to World War I, Britain started developing this huge bureaucracy and military state apparatus in order to make sure their capitalist profits didn't fall behind the capitalist profits of the other countries. And this is where you have Lenin talking about great powers fighting for the division of the world. And as capitalism develops, we've only seen the capitalists gain a stronger stranglehold on the state. I think in the United States, it's 93% of elections now are decided by who raises the most money. So clearly, whoever controls the means of production and whoever controls industry, most importantly, also controls the state. So you don't have a choice of just let's get rid of the state and everybody live in this happy capitalist free market society, because the capitalists are just going to monopolize. We already have Blackwater, this private security firm who does wars. They'll just privatize the military and do it that way.
All right. So
because the state is needed for the maintenance of this system.
All right.
So can I say something real quick?
Sure.
Yeah. So I would say our system is more like the dictatorship of the consumer, because ultimately the capitalist can't just do whatever he wants. He can do what he wants with his own property, but that's not really sustainable. What you have to do is to provide people what they want. If you don't provide to people what they want, you're not going to have people buying your product or voluntarily trading with you.
I mean, at a point of monopoly, though, it becomes that they're not even making what people want anymore. So I agree with you that there's some validity to a market system and that it creates competition. If you have a free market, if you have Apple, who dominates the phone market, they're going to make a dongle so that you have to buy an extra little piece of plastic to plug your phone into the headphone jack, because they completely control this market, you know. And in China now, you're seeing Huawei is crushing Apple. Nobody wants to buy Apple phones anymore because now their market actually has some competitiveness to it. And I'm not against, you know, under socialism or communism, you know, having some form of market sector where innovation is encouraged. But if you just let the capitalists run amok and do whatever they want in the market, they're always going to monopolize.
All right, well, if we're talking about monopolies, let's go into some entrepreneurship theory. The way that entrepreneurship happens in a capitalist economy is based on market disequilibriums, right? So when disequilibriums will always happen more when companies tend to monopolize. So when companies tend to monopolize, we'll see further hit the disequilibrium as monopolies inherently become more and more inefficient at making their planning more inefficient, causing more disequilibrium. So what happens then is new entrepreneurs realize that there's this disequilibrium in the market, realizing they have profit motives to make plans better. So then entrepreneurs will see this and invest their money into the market. And that's what's going to create the new competition in the market, causing a cycle. So if companies try to monopolize, disequilibrium happens. When further disequilibrium happens, that's when entrepreneurs see that. They think they see a profit opportunity as disequilibrium happens to make it better, causing some form of tendency towards equilibrium, which would cause competition to happen more in the market. So we wouldn't see monopolization happen. And on top of that, I'd like to go back to my original point of that claim, was that so if you guys presented the work or die dichotomy, and I'm saying that there is no actor forcing you to work inside a capitalist system. In order for there to be coercion or involuntary exchange, it requires someone going directly onto you for saying, work for me or I'm going to kill you. But there's no actor saying, work for me, I'm going to kill you. It's you voluntarily agreeing. Nature cannot coerce you. Nature is not an actor. It requires an action. So I want to ask my original question, who forces you to work? Because me and Bean have already outlined our ethical framework in regards to property rights. So if you're claiming this is an involuntary exchange, you have to further substantiate upon that. Because if we prove it is voluntary, then that claim runs away.
Right. Alex, I do want to get into that, but I do want to also go back to what you were saying about monopolies first. You were saying that monopolies, due to disequilibrium, will eventually fall out and entrepreneurs will eventually rise up because investors will put more money into the market when they see this disequilibrium. But that's ahistoric. If we look into the 1890s when we had, some of the most unregulated periods or the period in America, you see the monopolization of the railroad, you see the monopolization of the bank, you see the monopolization of oil companies. And these monopolies actually colluded together with each other. So Standard Oil would collude with the railroad industries saying, hey, if you don't give us preference when shipping your oil, we're not going to work with you and you're going to miss out on our business. So what they did was they colluded with the railroad companies, charging smaller businesses higher prices and actually forcing the small businesses out of the market. And the only way that these monopolies were broken up was antitrust laws were formed. And the government basically had to come in and say, okay, we're going to break Standard Oil up into 5 different companies, but you can't say that monopolies will just magically go away, especially when, again, during this 30-year period of the robber baron age, that's not what happened.
Yeah, this is more
I'm
like.
I'm happy you brought up the Gilded Age and Standard Oil. I'm very happy because I have a lot of stuff to say on that. But my argument is the theory of entrepreneurship. But we can go into history of it, because if companies find ways to produce at cheaper prices and provide cheaper prices for consumers while still being able to maintain that sustainably, sure, yeah. But if we looked at history, Standard Oil, I say was a positive thing, 1, and I'd say 2 was unsustainable as we saw its market share decrease. So Standard Oil was first formed in 1870, and it dissolved in 1911. Over the 41-year-old period, it reduced its price of kerosene from $1 a gallon to 10 cents a gallon and increased output by over 100%. So what we saw in this company is they were able to decrease prices, causing and increase outputs. So when this happens, that realized that the company was simply more efficient. So there's nothing necessarily bad about that efficient company, as they're providing the best product for the consumers. And if we go down to it, from 1870 to 1879, Standard Oil's company's market share fluctuated from 30 to 90%. Other companies formed for the sole purpose of being bought by Rockefeller. Right? Competing companies also brought Rockefeller's cheap oil and sold it back makes sense. Competition is dynamic at all. After 1950, market share was at a steep decline. After 1906, Standard Oil's market share never went over 25%. So as I was saying before, as monopolies form, we'll see entrepreneurship because disequilibrium happens, which will combat the disequilibrium markets with the monopolies, right? So this is the empirical evidence of Standard Oil proves my point that eventually monopolies are unsustainable, and entrepreneurship will combat that. As even before the Standard Oil suit, the thing was at like 25 market share.
Right, again, but they were colluding with the railroad companies and forcing other small businesses to pay higher prices when it came to shipping their oil. So because they had a monopoly on the oil industry, especially in the 1890s, that discouraged entrepreneurship. And again, the government had to step in because this company was getting so big. And another thing is, just because oil prices got cheaper, just because the consumer benefited, doesn't mean that the worker benefited necessarily. And that's, again, where me and Eddie are coming from. We're talking about the labor side. So what happens when you have a monopoly is that this monopoly is basically a monopsony, right? So they're the single buyer, and they have multiple sellers. In this case, the workers are the sellers selling their labor to Standard Oil. So what happens in a monopsony is the one company gets to decide where the price goes. So what happens is they drive the wages down when they're the only company, especially in some areas, that people are able to work at. And so workers, in this case, often got jobs that were low wages, horrible conditions, and had no say in how their company was run and how this very profitable company was distributing the profits that they were helping to generate.
Well, throughout this whole time, through an over 100-year period before we had any minimum wage laws, wages were increasing by an average of 1.4% per year, which isn't bad at all. And of course, there were many horrible conditions at that time, but that's just because we were going through industrialization. That's just a natural thing that happens. That happens with any country. It would happen with any system going through industrialization. But even then, worker conditions were drastically improving. Wages were not going down. Wages were going up. People were getting paid much more than what they were getting paid working on farms. And it was also significantly safer going and working in these factories. Like, I mean, yes, looking back now, we see the factories and we're like, oh, that's dangerous and that's dirty. But compared to the times, people moving to the city, it was significantly safer. Their lifespans increased. Children didn't have to work anymore. Like at some point in any country's history before industrialization, you're going to have children working, because if they aren't working, then they're going to die. You know, it's happened with every country. Of course, we don't want children to work, but that's just something that has to happen before you have enough resources to actually be able to sustain everyone. So children were able to stop working. Women were able to stay home with their children and take care of them. They weren't forced to have to go and work. So I don't really know what you mean by people being paid so little. Like during this time, worker conditions were drastically improving.
I mean, I would argue, though, that people were unionizing at the time and they were fighting for these conditions. And then post-Great Depression, you see an even bigger surge in that, where workers are saying, all right, capitalism, not only does it kind of leave the workers in a crappy situation compared to the owners, but it also breaks every 6 to 10 years. The whole system collapses. So we need to fight for some things, and we need to organize ourselves and start demanding a greater piece of the pie or protections, right? So almost everything that, as Lenin described it, sometimes the state appears as a mediator between the classes rather than an oppressor of one class. And that's because unions demand things from the state because, the labor theory of value, if the labor stops, the money stops for the capitalists. So if the laborers are in a union and they say, we're going to withhold our labor until you give us X, Y, and Z, they have to. And even the state has to, because the workers have the power to grind the entire economy to a halt. So here we have this principle of nonviolence, right? In the early 1900s, you had 1 million card-carrying communists in the U.S., and you had all these labor strikes that were going on, and these wildcat strikes, more in history in the 40s than at any other time. And this is when the government starts cracking down, because this is a system, capitalism, that pretends like it's voluntary, right? But as soon as the workers organize themselves and they say, oh, we don't like private property, that's when the state comes with the gun, and that's when they shut you down. When the Venezuelan workers who have had, who, by the way, Standard Oil, that monopoly, was extracting insane amounts of oil from Venezuela, which left their economy 100% dependent on oil. And then when Hugo Chavez says we're going to take this oil and turn it into social programs for the people, bam, 155 economic sanctions. And that's where you see the state enforcing private property rights, because the system wouldn't be able to maintain itself without that state. And even though sometimes the state appears as a mediator, as Matt was saying, and you guys were talking about, where it does things for the workers that are fought for, in the end, it is a tool of oppression of the proletariat that maintains property rights. That's the state's function, to maintain private property, which at this point is, you have Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos with $180 billion in assets fighting for over who the richest person in the world is, while 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. If there wasn't a state keeping the system going, 100 years ago, those workers would have been like, hey, this does not work out for us. And we would have changed it.
All right, so a lot of this is the economics part, but we'll get into the economics more later. Specifically, I'll address everything here. But in this specific part of the debate, we're debating the ethicality of it, and we're mentioning the ethic of the system. Me and Ben outlined property rights as an actual system. So we argue that everything ought to be voluntary. And my main question to you, Matt and Eddie, is how is work involuntary? If the workers are going to work voluntarily, there was no one acting to force them to work. And also, to clarify, me and Ben both don't believe in union busting. We believe it's inherently unjust, and we're both fine with unions.
Okay. I mean, well, if unions were allowed and the state just stayed out of a worker's business, that's what I'm saying. The workers would have organized a while ago, been like, hey, every time the system crashes, the state just seems to bail out the rich, and all they do is seem to, and all the money seems to go to the top, and they're just monopolizing while we work in these factories, and they would have demanded socialism. So I'm saying you can't even maintain this system without the state. So I had something else I was going to say. You go for a second, man.
Well, me and Bean, first off, don't believe in the current system. I believe that what you guys are talking about and the capitalists in bed of the state, they are all part of the political class. I'm going to outline the two ways you can acquire wealth. There's one, through production and exchange. Through people homesteading property, acquiring property, producing things, and selling it voluntarily. That is the first way to acquire wealth. The second one is what is called economic means or political means, and that is through expropriating property or stealing from people, right? These capitalists in the current state are part of the political class, I would say. So they were against the prime ideas that me and Bean are talking about. But I'd really like you to address the main point of my argument, which is how is work involuntarily if there's no one directly acting to force you to work?
Oh, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. So if tomorrow I decide to not get up and go to work and I stop working, I'll run out of money and I'll die. And my other option then is to meet up with my fellow workers and say, hey, private property is dumb. Let's take over the organization and run it for ourselves. And if we did that, we would be killed by the government. So you either have the choice of work, die, or organize and have the state come down on you with an iron fist.
Okay.
Which is something that the state has mostly been able to do in the global South here in America, because our workers have become so subservient to the current system. We're brainwashed into thinking this is a voluntary system, so our government can go elsewhere and put down, workers' rebellions in the Middle East or in Latin America or wherever else, because they don't even have to focus here at home anymore. They've so sufficiently crushed our unions and crushed the hope of any kind of better system.
I mean, I would argue that any system is ultimately work or die. Like right here, we've got 5 people, right? So comparing it to like a capitalist system, we can say like, I'm a capitalist. You 4 are workers. So you work. And if you don't work, you don't get money. And then eventually you die. Well, I mean, let's say we have a communist system. All of us are communists and we're working to get resources. What happens when one of us isn't working? I mean, maybe the others could help sustain him, but ultimately the others are working in order for him to survive. Like you can say, okay, there's some people who aren't working to survive, but ultimately there still has to be other people who are working to survive. You're just taking the burden and shifting it onto them. And even under capitalism, under the system, we support volunteerism. We still support things like private charity. So, I mean, if there's people who can't work, for whatever reason, they can't work at all, can't work for a certain period. Something bad happens. We believe in charity. We believe in mutual aid, people helping each other. So we don't believe in like an ultimatum, like you must work or you will die. And that's not how it happens in practice either. In the early 1900s, we saw great rises of mutual aid societies and even things like poverty insurance and just people coming together and helping each other, even throughout like the Great Depression. So like, I don't think that's really in practice what actually happens.
Yeah. So
can I add on to that quickly?
Yeah.
I just want to add on to that and the idea of the work or die dichotomy. You can say that these things are work or die, but that does not make something involuntary by nature. So basically, I can have the option to work or die, but if there's no one forcing me to die or to work, then it still would be voluntary if there's no one forcing me. So there has to be an enforcer to you to decide you to work. Second, you mentioned how workers can't just go and like, try to like take over people's property. Yeah, property ownership is normative. So it's a negative right to something. So no one else can take it away. And me and Bean have already presented in our opening statement on how the principle of non-aggression is logically consistent with logical principles, meaning that you cannot actually go and take away other people's property despite whatever you please to do.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about the labor thing. So you said labor is existent in every society, right? So that's the one thing Marx observed. You know, people talk about Marx failed to observe human nature. Actually, the one thing he noticed that humans do throughout society or throughout any mode of production is we labor collectively. So you had tribal society where they, you know, hunter gatherer, whatever. And then eventually you had feudalism where you labor for the lord, and the lord essentially serves as the state, and the army is there to protect the nobility and protect the ruling class. Kind of the same as it works in capitalism. And then you have the development of capitalism where labor is organized in a way where the masses work while a small minority own, and that minority becomes smaller and smaller because the system isn't static, right? It develops, and it develops itself into monopoly capitalism and imperialist capitalism. So, you know, as feudalism turned into capitalism, there's a better way to organize capitalism, which is there's a better way to organize labor, which is socialism. Not to say that capitalism's worse than slave society, not to say that it's feudalism, but it's much worse than socialism due to the anarchy of market production. So I'm kind of going off into my economics argument.
So let me just go back to that original point, because the bottom line is, if a lot of these consequentialist takes you guys say, even if we presuppose to be true, we have outlined that our ethical justification is not based on consequentialism or consequences of actions. We do not believe the ends justify the means. What me and Bean have outlined so far is a logical chain that leads to the conclusion of the right to property and the non-aggression principle, right? So we want to have a system based on that. You are also equivocating the current American system to the ideal system me and Bean advocate for, which should be one based upon a non-aggression principle, meaning no one can aggress on another person. And you have still yet to present to me who is forcing you to work under a system. Because if work is still voluntary, then there's nothing going against our ethical framework. Because our ethical framework is based on this logical chain that we presented earlier, which what we view as just and unjust being what is voluntary, involuntary.
I'm saying your non-aggression principle is wrong because every time there's some kind of workers' movement or socialist movement, the state comes and puts it down with violence. That is aggression. Anytime the masses of society look to create a new society where it's not production organized by the minority, the state comes and beats them down. If the masses of society wish to move to something else, and the state doing that is violence. So there's already violence in the current system. This is why the United States, and I know you guys don't defend the United States, but this is what capitalism becomes. It becomes a system where these capitalists need to expand elsewhere. And now the U.S. has 1,000 military bases around the world because capitalists need to constantly expand their profit and keep the world's proletariat under which is violence, which is imposed by violence, and the state has a monopoly on violence.
I mean, pointing out that the government has utilized violence and violating the non-aggression principle in order to preserve, certain cronies that's in their pockets. I don't think that doesn't necessarily refute the non-aggression principle. That just points out some people violate it. Like we don't support anyone doing any of those violations.
Okay, but how do you expect to get to a better system then? If you're just saying,
We're talking
So
about
me and Matt,
I want to say something first. Alex, to answer your question, I think that you're saying that it's a voluntary exchange. Do you think that the power balance is equal? Are you saying that the capitalist and the worker have equal power balances? Because
in our current
equal
system,
balance of power.
In our current system or in my ideal system?
I mean, I guess
in the current system, there's certain sets of power. In our current system, there's certain sets of power within the political class and the different property owners. I like to say a famous quote: "An expropriating property protector is a contradiction in terms." The state is antithetical to mine and Bean's conception of what we advocate for. So, by you guys equivocating our ideal system of capitalism and the modern day system of crony capitalism does not mean that our system of capitalism is going to be the same today. Our system of capitalism would be one truly based on free exchange and non-Contradiction principle, right?
Okay.
But I don't think that capitalism will ever get to a point where there's an equal balance of power between the worker and the capitalist, the owner, because the capitalist has all of this money. They have a pool of unemployed people from which to get their labor, giving them an upper hand in setting the wages, giving them an upper hand in paying for private security. I think that's something you guys advocate for.
Could I ask a question quick? I don't understand how you guys expect to get to this system. So Matt and I say the workers need to organize themselves,
getting to the system,
rise up, seize major industry and banks, and put it into our own hands. You guys are just like, well, fingers crossed they don't monopolize and the government
deregulation.
If my society is achievable or not is kind of irrelevant. Right, I could say both of our systems are almost impossible to be achieved at this point.
How is that irrelevant?
No. Listen, let me finish my statement. So, just because my ideal system will not be complete, this is a debate on which system is better, my ideal system or your system in this regards, right? So, my system would have this certain method of operating. You are equivocating it to the current system, which me and Ben wholeheartedly reject the current system. So I'm arguing from the basis of if you're already in my system, which system is better. Strategy and actually achieving it is a completely different thing. As I presented before, we can use like a Connolly theory of entrepreneurship to show that monopolies are unsustainable, and the only way they can actually get big at a certain point is through providing cheaper goods and giving laborers higher wages and these different things. But this actual relevance of the entrepreneurial strategic of based on monopolies will still have entrepreneurship come and combat that. But the whole point is irrelevant if you can't establish why our system is somehow involuntary. Because we justified, on our opening statement, we outlined a line of logic, right? And we say that our system has no state. We want a society free of involuntary exchanges. So we want to abolish the state and have respect private property. And from there, then we can say that our system is more ethical. And as we've outlined before, which you still haven't refuted the actual ethical justification we provided before.
Well, I'm not here to see who can come up with the greatest utopian society. I'm here to promote scientific socialism, which is the idea that out of the ashes of capitalism, we can create a new and better system, because that's how the world works. We don't get to say, oh, tomorrow I hope we go to a free market capitalist system where the government and monopolies go away. You need to take the current system and you need to build something better. And the only way to do that is to wrestle state power from the capitalists and put it into the hands of the workers, and eventually put production themselves into the hands of the workers, which is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. You know, did you have something to say, Matt? Sorry.
Yeah, and again, this presupposes that the balance of power. This presupposes that the balance of power between capitalists and workers is equal. And again, if Ben said earlier that the capitalism is the dictatorship of the consumer, right? So you're going to be working towards the interests of the consumer at the behest, at the neglect of the workers.
Well, I mean, I think the argument you made kind of
workers are the ones who make consumers, right? It doesn't. Okay, wait. So it doesn't really matter what kind of power balance you're trying to analyze in the system, right? The bottom line is if there's no one forcing you to work, then that work is voluntary. And if we go further than that point, you guys are saying, oh, scientific socialism will establish this because it's better. But in order to establish better, you must have some sort of normative ethical framework to determine what we ought to do and we ought not do. So what is good, what is bad? We have presented our framework of ethics, of the non-negotiation principle, and the logical consistencies we presented earlier. And we have still yet to hear a rebuttal on how that, because if that holds true, so if our ethical framework is true, then capitalism is more ethical. But our logic is true. Therefore, capitalism is more ethical. If P, then therefore Q, right? So we need a response to the actual ethical framework that we proposed. You can't just say a state has violated rights before, violated the NAP. We agree. We don't believe in a state.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. We both have the same goal, kind of. You guys want this society with no violence, where everybody flourishes, where you're able to exchange freely, and there's no state extracting violence. The only thing is, you don't have any way to get there, right? I agree that that's where we want to get. I agree that we want to get to a prosperous society where nobody's exploiting anyone and everything's voluntary and there's no violent state. But the only way to get to that is through scientific socialism. You can't just, everyone become libertarian one day and just hope and eventually the government will go away and companies will stop monopolizing, because that's not how the system works, which is exactly what Marxists have been saying for hundreds of years, right? Luxemburg wrote this book saying that capital was going to accumulate at the top. And I mean, what has happened? And you can say, I don't agree with that. I wish we would go back to, the Wild West or whatever your ideal system is. But we have to deal with the conditions that we actually live in. And as capitalism develops as a system, power and control of the means of production become concentrated at the top, and then are used to do imperialism. So I guess, technically your utopian society that you believe in is kind of the same as ours, but I just have an actual path to get there.
And Alex, and I think it also actually is important if your society is achievable and how you get there, right? We can be talking about this, but if it's not achievable, you can have this ideal ethical framework, right? But if there's no way to get there, if there's no way to achieve this pure free market capitalism, then the power will still be in the owning class, and it will still be not as voluntary of an exchange as you wish it would be under your free market system.
Yeah. All right. So again, I'm going to reach the point of this debate. The point of this debate is to prove what system is better, is more ethical, and which one is better like economically. So the question I'm asking to you, which is still not been addressed properly, I completely reject the idea that socialism abides on my principles, right? My principles believe is like self-ownership, homesteading. People homestead property, they can own property. Socialism inherently is antithetical to the idea of property rights, as it prevents certain people from owning certain things and doing certain things with their own property, which is a prerequisite of the right to property. So the idea that you can have a socialist or communist system, which would be in line with my views and my ethics, is completely incompatible. As the NAP, the logical conclusion of the non-negotiation principle, which we have presented before, is an anarcho-capitalist society, which is what we advocate for.
Yeah, and not to mention, Alex already brought up, he already talked about monopolies, so I'm not really sure why you can keep going back to the monopoly point without actually refuting his argument. And also, as to what Matt was saying, this situation you describe assumes like a static economy where you have, the way you described it, it's like there's only one business, you only have one option. In reality, businesses have to compete for workers. That's just what happens, right? That's why we don't have everyone getting paid minimum wage in America. That's why in the past year we saw Target, Hobby Lobby, Amazon, Bank of America, several companies raising their wages to $15, $20 an hour. And I'll completely concede that some of these companies did this to kind of encourage higher minimum wages in order to hurt their competitors. But even then, we still see companies raising their wages in order specifically to compete for workers.
And to add on to the monopoly point, I presented a theory of entrepreneurship, which is still have to be debunked. I'm saying disequilibriums happen as more monopolization happens. And from disequilibriums, that's when entrepreneurship rises to combat that disequilibrium, putting it closer to equilibrium, having more better planning. And when economies are further in disequilibrium, that means that it'll always be more inefficient compared to ones that are closer to equilibrium. So entrepreneurship is a way to get closer to equilibrium, causing more competition and causing overall non-monopolization to happen.
So why hasn't that happened in the washer and dryer market? If you ask any software engineer, they'll tell you for the past 40 years they've been designing they've been designing their parts to break on purpose. I have a washing machine from 40 years ago, and this is subjective evidence, but you can ask anyone. Once you have a monopoly who controls this market, you have planned obsolescence. Everyone knows this. And it's not like there are, what example can you point to where a monopoly completely controls a market and then like some guy enters the market, some entrepreneur, and just destroys it? I mean, maybe the MyPillow guy who's always going on Fox News, but I mean, it's
Standard
not like
Oil was an example.
they were busted up by the government.
Yeah, they were antitrust laws.
I mean, ultimately, Standard Oil couldn't keep going because people went from lamps to electric lights. Like it wouldn't have lasted.
In my argument for Standard Oil, I literally presented the case. It started off, the company founded in 1870, dissolved in 1911, right? Over the 41-year period, they dropped the price of kerosene from a gallon by like 90%. It went from $1 to 10 cents for overall benefit and increased output by over 100%. But the biggest point is Rockefeller's market share dropped from 90% to 25% before being broken up by the government.
Okay, so now you're making the technological advancements, though. That doesn't prove that an entrepreneur entered the market. You're saying that what they were producing was overtaken by technology, which that would happen under socialism or capitalism. That doesn't prove that entrepreneurs are entering the market and beating monopolies. I mean, I don't think. Does anyone see that happening? Everywhere there's a monopoly controlling the market, there's just entrepreneurs dying to come up with something better. I mean, what would they?
Like,
you mentioned Apple, right?
Case of it happening in history with more regulated markets. Today, it's not really the same because today we have massive regulated markets. We have like over 150,000 pages in regulations, which hurts actual competition from having the market. But in my ideal system, which is a free market system, then we'd have this entrepreneurship coming to combat this. I even showed it historically. I showed it theoretically. So I don't see what the problem with monopoly is. Also, you're saying that, new technology, but in order to create that new technology, we needed entrepreneurship in the first place. That's why the market share went down from Rockefeller.
Right, and you literally mentioned Apple earlier in this debate. This is actually a good example of our side, right? Apple, they invented the smartphone. They had a monopoly on the smartphone because it was an innovative monopoly. Then other companies began making their own smartphones. Now, most companies have better smartphones than Apple. Not only that, but like the thing you mentioned, some companies like to make their products where they break so they make more money. Once that comes out about Apple, Apple loses thousands and thousands of customers. They go to the other companies because the other companies treat people better. Pretty much everything you're saying is like proving our point. So
I mean, smartphones didn't come about. I mean, they did come about from entrepreneurship, but they also came about from billions of dollars of government research put into NASA for, space exploration. New technological advancements came from government spending.
And here's
out of this came the internet. Out of that came smartphones. Absolutely.
And I'm not rejecting, as I said, the idea that markets don't stimulate some kind of, trying to create consumer goods, some kind of, innovativity between Apple and Android or whoever else. What I'm saying is that doesn't take into account labor at all. So there's a famous story about Steve Jobs when they were making the first iPhone. The iPhone was a big block and the engineer gave it to him and Steve Jobs said it's too big. And the engineer said, we can't make it smaller. And he drops it in a fish tank and bubbles come up and he goes, you can make it smaller, go back and make it smaller. And they tell you that story, in business class and marketing class in college, like, oh, look at what a genius Steve Jobs is. But he's not the one doing the innovating. It's the engineers, and you can have a market system without Steve Jobs even existing. But I guess that was a little bit of a tangent. It didn't prove the monopolization thing totally. But yeah, there's still some competition that exists. Like I mentioned, Apple and Huawei. But it's not like you have competition between entrepreneurs. It's not like, me or Matt who were born to teachers with, $100,000 in debt from school or whatever. It's not like we can just enter these markets. If I had the greatest idea for a smartphone ever, I couldn't enter the market. And I think the kind of system that you guys want and we want is one where people have more equal power, and technically if you had a good idea, you could spend your time making it and you could be innovative. But right now, the vast majority of society work as wage slaves all day. And 78% of them are living paycheck to paycheck, which, and I know you guys say that's not your ideal system, but again, this is what capitalism becomes. And monopolies will take over and fight with each other to take over the market, but it's still monopolies at the end of the day.
You can have multiple monopolies. That's a bit of a contradiction, but but again, I have presented my case of entrepreneurship, a train of logic, saying why monopolies won't happen. And if it does happen, it will go down immediately. right? You're saying, oh, if we have an idea, then we won't be able to like do it. Why not? Under this system, maybe, but under my ideal system, like a free banking, and you have private banks who are willing to issue currency. If you have a good idea, people will invest in that idea to get returns back to them to make profits, right? So there's no reason that monopoly doesn't happen. You're saying, oh, monopolies, without substantiating why it will happen. I presented a case of why it won't happen.
You said you want to privatize all the banks. That's exactly how it happens. And that's how it happened in the early 1800s and grew to the point where now, essentially monopolies dominate the entire economy, is because of the banks. So you have the industrial capitalists, and the banks start to tie themselves together because they realize if they have, if they ally with each other, they can more thoroughly dominate the markets. And then you see those capitalists and banks go to the state and they say, state, help us out, help us to dominate these markets. And then you see state monopoly capitalism develop. So if you leave the banks, these institutions of finance capital, to do whatever they want, they're going to team up with the capitalists and they're going to dominate every market, which is what we have now with, Goldman and Sachs and all these giant financial institutions. They're cartels. And there's no way to prevent that unless you nationalize them, unless you put those banks and industry into the hands of the masses. As long as you protect their private property rights with the state, they're always going to monopolize. And yes, those monopolies might die out over time, but they're still controlling the market, right? Your system of free trade is impossible as long as you allow for private property.
So can I say like two things real quick? So going back to what you said, you gave your little story about, Steve Jobs. They present to him the phone they created, and he says, go back, fix this issue, right? So I think I don't really see the issue with that. Organizers are very important. Certainly engineers are vital, right? But okay, let's say you're building cars, right? And you have the engineers building cars, and they want to build the best car they can, and this is their thing. Their thing is engineering, right? So let's say they want to make titanium bumpers because a titanium bumper is nice and strong. It'll protect the car, right? But that's not efficient in any way. You can't spend all that money, all those resources. Titanium is a very important resource. You can't spend all those resources just on car bumpers. It's much more valuable being used in other areas, right? So you have to have some sort of organizer pointing out, no, we need to, there's other things we have to take care of other than these specific ones that you want as an engineer. The job of the engineer, again, is very important, but without the organizer, okay, do you want the block phones, or do you want the organizer to go to the engineer and point out there's other things that are more important, other things that are less important, and let me just guide you through this because I'm trying to give the people what they want, whereas the engineer is usually designing what they want, right? And then the other thing is you keep, pointing to our current system and saying, well, capitalism goes into this. Well, I would argue America was never even capitalist. With the founding of America, we had some very capitalist founding fathers like Thomas Edison, and he wanted to do things like ban slavery, right? Which I think is a very capitalist thing to do. But we did not ban slavery. We still had slavery being enforced. I would say that's very anti-capitalist. Not only that, but one of the first laws passed by Continental Congress was tariffs that led to a recession. That's not capitalist at all. We were never a capitalist country. We were never meant to be a capitalist country. Yes, we were very close because it was a pretty free market. But again, we weren't founded as a capitalist country. So I would say America does not prove that capitalism will go into crony capitalism or whatever you want to call it.
I want to add one thing to that. It seems you guys have a fundamental misunderstanding of how the market economy works, and specifically in a free market. You guys are saying that, the people are just monopolized, it's in the company's self-interest. But you have to understand what dictates profits and what dictates losses, right? Under a free market, the only way you can make a profit is through consumer purchasing things from you, right? So the only way to do stuff is for consumers to buy from you, right? Monopolies in itself are inefficient by nature, as they have worse price establishing. They have, further states of disequilibrium compared to what would have like an entrepreneurial and market economy. But the fundamental thing is consumers dictate the market economy. Entrepreneurs base their investment on what they think consumers are going to demand, and they're going to use that demand to produce things that they want to provide for them. And if they do good, they're going to make a profit because consumers are going to buy from them. If they're doing bad, they're going to take a loss, and they're going to be out of the market, which is the good thing. So they're not doing good jobs for the consumers.
Yeah. So I guess I'll take it one by one, unless you wanted to go really bad, Matt. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, but I forgot. You can go ahead. I'll remember it.
Okay, so going back to the Apple thing, I mean, nobody's saying we're not going to have managers, right? It's just what does Tim Cook do for? Is that the Apple CEO? You know, or what do Apple shareholders, the people who own a lot of stock in Apple, have to do with the production process? You know, nothing. We want managers and engineers and workers involved with the process. Anybody who's involved, you know, with the actual production. And we see what the shareholders are taking home from Apple is just shareholder profits. That is exploitation and surplus value. And we say that if workers own the means of production, you can reinvest that money in things that help humanity, and you can make sure the workers are living more comfortable lives themselves. But then, what was the next point? Yeah, I mean, you guys, I think the main point of distinction here, and this is definitely what I noticed when I was reading the Libertarian Manifesto, it seems like you guys have this ideal system cooked up in your head where you're like, America's never been capitalist. It's like, okay, so how do we get to your system? You know, it's like, what if libertarians took over the government? What would they do tomorrow other than, you know, abolish Medicare and Medicaid and sell private utilities off to private corporations, right? Whereas our system, scientific socialism, looks at the material conditions as they are now, and we could give you A, B, and C, very specific things that we want to do in order to transfer the means of production into the hands of the workers. So I almost reject the idea that I need to debate against your utopian society that you've imagined in your head. Like, I could imagine the greatest utopian society ever, and you know, if you say, oh, but socialism, I'll call my utopian society socialism, and then you go, oh, but look at what happened with socialism in the Soviet Union. I say, no, not real socialism, which is kind of the tactic that a lot of leftists use. That doesn't make any sense. You know, what is the point of debating politics if your system, your ideal system, has no basis in the real world?
Because when we discuss systems, right, there must be ethical prescriptions prescribed with it. There is what is right and what is wrong. And there's normative ethics, which is what we ought do, and ought not do, right? So in this debate, me and Bean, it's literally irrelevant if our system is achievable or not, if it's more ethical, right? I will still advocate for the most ethical system that exists, even if it won't be achieved. I still believe that is the most just. And I still believe that. I still believe that ANCAP has a chance to exist in some certain ways. ANCAP, in a sense, exists today, not really, though, because, like, each voluntary exchange that happens in today's society is, I'd say, a voluntarist transaction. There is no government in that exchange happening right there. I just want that for every exchange to be, so every exchange is voluntary, right? So the whole point of this debate of me and Ben is proving that our system is more ethical to your system. And that's what we have presented so far. We've presented the line of logic of leading to the non-aggression principle. More than based on the non-aggression principle. Your system is inherently anti the non-aggression principle because you're anti the right to property, which is what was based on.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to debate in the future about how you can achieve your system, you know, that's something we could do, but that just wasn't really the point of this. You know, there's plenty of libertarian theory. It's not like libertarians completely ignore that. There's lots of libertarian theories on how to achieve libertarianism. There's agorists, there's people who are more into electoral politics. And, you know, I could, like what you said, libertarians aren't for, you know, getting someone in the presidency and just like flipping everything the next day. Like, I mean, we know how the world works. Like, I mean, if you look at any of the platforms of libertarians who ran for president. I mean, even Joe Jorgensen supported going towards a system like a healthcare system, more like Singapore, which isn't at all the free market system, but the way she was doing it was freeing up the market in many different ways, but also making sure you take care of poor people. Because, I mean, we know we can't just flip to private charity overnight. Like, that's just not possible. But it is important to go towards that area. But I mean, again, like this isn't really something me and Alex were expecting to debate, so we didn't prepare for this debate, and I don't think it's really relevant, just like Alex said.
I mean, if you want to talk about ethics too, I mean, that's the point. Is as Mark said, capitalism is a system that works in movement. It's not just stagnant. And as it increases its wealth, as it creates more things, as human labor creates more things that we see around us in society, the misery creates. Sure, we have more things. Sure, we have more consumer goods. But, you know, in the richest country in the world, 78% of people live paycheck to paycheck. And if you read the study recently conducted by Seresta Whiteskin, which is capitalism, socialism, and the physical quality of life, which, you know, our ethics is to create the best system for the masses, right? Capitalism is a system which, you know, gives maximum freedom to those who own private property. What we would like to do is create a system that works for the benefit of the masses by destroying the anarchy of market production to a certain degree, and then by abolishing private property rights and making things publicly owned. And in this study, they found that physical qualities of life, when you compared socialist countries to what they had before versus what was accomplished after going towards socialism, socialist countries beat capitalist countries. Because as we said, as long as you have this minority of people who own the means of production and then the rest of society works for them, it's going to be a shit deal for the masses of society. And that's exactly what we've seen. I know, like, maybe I'm basing my analysis in the material reality of what we've seen, but I guess that's just Marxism, right? It's not, let's imagine some kind of society. But I mean, if you want the ethics of my ideal society, yeah, it's a society of no coercion, where things are publicly owned, where human labor power is used for the development of the masses rather than the enrichment of a few.
I know what study you are referring to. I think that's a very bad study for people to use, like, methodologically. Like, first of all, of course, the capitalist countries, like, none of them, they certainly aren't the type of capitalists me and Alex support. But even then, most of these countries, like, okay, for example, Somalia was under a Marxist-Leninist military dictatorship, and several other countries. Let me see here.
Never is.
Like literally half the countries, honestly, like half the countries on the capitalist list were run by socialist and left-wing governments. Some of the countries on the capitalist list had just recently switched to, you know, capitalism. And there's just so many issues with this. It doesn't account for anything like how long how long they were into this system. Not only that, but I have issues with some of the measurements they used, like infant mortality rate, which is measured differently from country to country. And specifically, one of the countries they used, Cuba, there was a study done. It was published in Oxford, where they examined the infant mortality rate and life expectancy and stuff like that. And if you want me to send this to you later, I can absolutely do that. I don't have it right in front of me right now because I wasn't expecting you to use this. But I do have a ton of sources on this. Like, first of all, I have like 4 studies that counter this one that go into much greater detail and have completely opposite conclusions. But this paper published in Oxford, they found that the infant mortality rate and the life expectancy in Cuba didn't mathematically add up. Like, there was major issues with it, and they found that the government was enforcing certain like outcomes. Like, they said, you doctors have to have these outcomes or else you're going to jail, right? So it encouraged people to lie. Not only that, but, you know, as far as like infant mortality rate in Cuba, I think it's like 40% of pregnancies ended in abortion. So especially any situation where a fetus has any sort of physical disability or anything like that, where they might die as an infant, they're already dead, right? And those aren't counted as deaths. Miscarriages aren't counted as infant deaths in Cuba, whereas in those capitalist countries they are. So like, and we can go into like every other country, and they all have these issues. So just comparing those countries like that absolutely isn't valid at all, in my opinion. And again, I can give you like 4 other studies on this very subject that completely disagree with this, and they go into much greater detail and have much better methodology.
I mean, that's fine, but even if you look at, I mean, oh, sorry, you guys go. I've been going forever.
Let me specify one more thing, right? So, in this portion of the debate, this was supposed to be tailored towards ethics, the ethicality of other systems, right? We presented a logical case of why the non-aggression principle comes to be, right? So we ought simply present a logical case that creates normative ethics, which would be we ought to do this. In our system, we presented a case for the non-aggression principle, right? Having a system based on that. And from there, we want to have that system based on protecting property rights. That's what the NAP is based off of. So if your system, at its core, rejects the principle of a property right, then it goes very against the ethical framework we prescribed. You'd have to justify why your consequentialist or utilitarian ethical framework is justified in violating individual rights or the individual's right to property.
It's
Yeah. So at the beginning, in my opening statement, I said that there is a distinction between private property and personal property. So again, nobody's advocating that they're going to come take your house, and even small businesses. Like, there's a difference between this personal property and private property. Private property rights only benefit those that have private property. And this is, again, a minority of people. Because again, the majority of the workforce is made up of workers. So when you have a system that protects such a slight few at the expense of the majority, for example, in the housing market right now, people own multiple houses. This is decreasing the supply of houses, jacking up the prices of the housing market. You know, a bunch of foreign capital is currently in our housing market, again, jacking up the price of the housing market because the supply is decreased. I don't know how you guys feel about people owning more than one house, but that is, you know,
and that's
the protection of private property rights.
I'm saying that private property is violently enforced by the state. That's not just some natural thing that occurs. In order to maintain private property rights, you need a state with a monopoly on violence in order to enforce those private property rights. Right there, that's your violence. If not, you know, in the 40s and early 1900s, we would have had socialism already. But the capitalists have used the state to oppress every proletarian movement.
All right. So let me continue. So, do you guys distinct between private and personal property? I don't care. There's property rights. The right to own property. There's no real distinction between private and personal property, as both are acquired through two ways, as I've said before. So the way to acquire property is two ways. One is through either first appropriating the property through homesteading, or voluntarily contractually transferring ownership to someone else. Or two, through political means, which would be expropriating that property, right? Those are two ways to actually acquire property. So, under my system, I don't believe in any expropriation of property. I believe in abolishing the political means. So I only want to have homesteading and then voluntary exchange. The way that property is acquired is through homesteading and voluntary exchange. Everything else would be anti to the idea of property rights. There was always property rights are relevant between the distinction between personal and private, as they're realistically the same thing. They homestead property. They use that property to they'll turn it into a capital good. They employ in the production process to produce another good. And that's, you'll see like production happen. But having like you're saying a state will protect property. As I said before, an expropriating property protector is a contradiction in terms. Because a state is an organization which maintains itself through political means, making it very antithetical to the idea of property rights.
Aren't you pro-police? Or I know Bean is pro-police, like as a minarchist, right?
I'm pro-police.
And the police. So you're not anymore, Bean?
So the pro-police is like a very arbitrary statement. I'm not a minarchist anymore. I'm a voluntarist. I don't know what you mean specifically by pro-police, so I can't say I am or am not.
What I mean is, I remember when I first became aware of you, I think that you said that you support the idea of taxes funding military, courts, and police. Do you still hold that view?
Oh, no, that was just me saying, like, as a minarchist, I supported the existence of a state that was just the military, courts, and police, not through taxes, but through voluntary taxes.
So me and Bean both believe in voluntary contracts with your own. So we believe everyone should be self-governed. And it's based on self-ownership. If you just own self-ownership, then you own products you homestead, right? So you own property that way, right? A state, by very nature, is one that goes against property rights, as it is an organization of political means that exploits property. We see this through stuff like taxation today, not like being against free markets, being against all these different things that were antithetical to the idea of property rights. My system, and me believe arguments is the case, and the overall ethicality of our systems is we believe in the protection of property rights through voluntary policing, right?
So this is what I'm saying, though. If you take the state away, so if the state goes away, the workers would just rise up and do socialism. I mean, like, take Nicaragua, for example. When you had the Sandinistas come to power, they said, what? Okay, let me finish. So when the Sandinistas came to power in Nicaragua, they were going to give all the factories back to the workers immediately, right? It had been essentially exploited by multinational corporations like the United Fruit Company for years and years and years and years. The workers rose up. They said, we're going to do something. Their only option then a lot of them wanted to do socialism right away. Let's immediately give all the land back to the workers. And then some of them said, no, the US is going to come kill us soon. We need to create a state to protect ourselves, a worker state. And then you had the US funding paramilitary death squads and the Contras. So I'm saying without the CIA to send the Contras in to protect the property rights of the multinationals who are exploiting Nicaragua, you would have had socialism. Same thing goes for the U.S. You had 1 million card-carrying communists in the U.S. in the early 1900s and the largest wildcat strikes in history. And the state came and broke them up. You know, the workers by now, because we are the majority, would have demanded socialism if it weren't for the oppressive nature of the state, which maintains the system.
So I completely disagree that people demand socialism. That socialism is an economically very inefficient system, which I'll substantiate in a bit if we want to get into the more economic factor of it. But if we're talking like a voluntary society, I wouldn't be against like voluntary communes forming. I'd be perfectly fine with it if everyone agrees voluntarily. But at the very core of your principle, you guys believe in abolishing all forms of capitalism, all forms of private property, which would be antithetical to the idea of property rights. As property rights imply that I'm allowed to do what I want with my property as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of other people. And it doesn't.
Yeah, we don't believe in private property rights. We reject private property. Private property is the stem of all the evils of capitalism. I'm saying if you have private property, it'll always evolve into imperialism.
Private property is used to infringe upon people's rights all the time today. I mean, capitalism, especially in today's system, and I know you guys don't like that, but it seeks short-term profits, and it does not account for negative externalities like climate change, which negatively affects lower-income communities. So, I mean, capitalism, which, again, doesn't care about these negative externalities,
we can go into
so this private property is going to be used to harm other people.
We can go into the economics part of the debate if you guys want. Like, obviously, me and Alex.
Yeah, how long are we gonna go? I actually got to work at 6 a.m., but I'm down to like have my statement prepared. Okay,
wait. So this part is going nowhere. The actual ethical parts. I'll just reiterate. We presented our ethical basis at the start of the debate. We presented the idea of the non-aggression principle and why. Are ethical to the property rights. You're trying to draw a distinction between private and personal property, which is there's no real distinction in regards to what I view my idea of rights. As humans, homestead property, they come to own that property. Property is property. There's no real distinction between private and personal in my view. So from that, I'll just say that we ought not take away people's property, as that would be antithetical to the idea of property rights, which comes upon through homesteading and the homestead process. To deny one exclusive control for oneself and deny one's own self-ownership, you would simply fall into performative contradiction under our ethics of argumentation.
Well,
there's a big difference between a house and an oil rig, right? Like a private company owning an oil field versus a house. That's a huge difference.
Private
property.
One is used to exploit workers. The other is used as a house.
The strict definition in Marxist economics is private property is property which is used to make more, either expand that capital or to make money. Personal property is your toothbrush. I don't use my toothbrush to make money. And if I owned an oil rig, that would be private property, and my toothbrush would be personal property. We're against private property. We think everybody should have toothbrushes. In fact, we should mass produce them for homeless people. But we don't think people should have private property. That the system of production should be publicly owned because that'll work better for the masses. And people like, and socialism's not an ideology for everyone. I'm sure this doesn't sound great if your dad owns a business, but if you wake up and work for $10 an hour like me, wouldn't you want to create a system where the private property is owned by the masses rather than a few people who you've never met in your life?
All right. So, I'm saying that property rights in general. The house and the factory are both examples of property, right? So they both have ownership claims to them based in homesteading. Property that does not come through homesteading or voluntary agreement would be illegitimately owned property through expropriation of property, which means being against. We are saying that all these normative frames of property rights is the idea that we're going by. The idea, in my view of rights, is irrelevant to the idea because they both own their ownership. There's nothing in personal property versus private property that makes one of them more unjust than each other.
So you're saying that you can't draw the difference between an oil rig and a toothbrush because they both got their basis in homesteading?
Well, hey, that's how property is acquired. That's the basis of property rights. And we said before,
they still have completely different functions in reality.
It doesn't mean anything can function in reality. I can own a phone and own a wallet, right? They're two different things, right? They're both my property, though.
They're both personal property, but if you own another person,
I think you guys are just misunderstanding Alex's position. He's not trying to say, like, we both know the Marxist definition of personal and private property. He's not trying to say, oh, it's just the same thing. He's talking about our justification for the existence of property applies to both. And you guys haven't really provided an actual argument as to why it's okay to violate property in the one part, but it's not okay to violate property in the other.
Because that property was received through a primitive accumulation at first, and then now is maintained, like I said, by the violent state who protects the property rights of, mostly people who inherit it, mostly folks like Wyatt Ingram Koch, who was handed an oil empire by his fathers. Right. This is how private property works, and it's passed down through generations. And that private property can only make money through the exploitation of the working masses. Right. A capitalist can own all the oil rigs he wants. If nobody goes and works on them, he makes zero money. Yeah. Right. He needs to have a way to get people to work, which is why you need the state to enforce those property rights. Otherwise, their workers would say, let's just take the oil rig for ourselves.
OK, so you want to talk about exploitation theory?
I'll talk about exploitation theory. Yeah, let's get to that. But
I mean, how long are we gonna go? Oh, for real, I really gotta work at 6 a.m. I like talking to you guys for real. We can do it again.
I'll address
I do have to work.
The idea of exploitation, one, in the Marxian conception, I still believe all work is voluntary, as there is no one forcing you to work, which I have presented multiple times throughout this debate and still haven't gotten an answer to who is forcing you to work. You guys keep drawing these false equivalencies between my ideal system and the current state apparatus of America, which is insanely different than what I advocate for. In my system, there's no one forcing you to live under a state apparatus, right? And from this point, we will go into exploitation, right? So if work is voluntary, which I presented a case for, as there's no one forcing you to work, that means that the exploitative nature, if you call it exploitation or what, that still wouldn't be inherently unjust and unethical. If you want to talk about surplus, then I'll bring up time preference as entrepreneurs input property to first, produce goods to get a higher return. There would be no investment if entrepreneurs wouldn't get a return higher in the future. So it's not a phenomenon of surplus value; it's a phenomenon of time preference happening and the rate of current versus future goods.
And I don't reject your idea that work is voluntary. It's just like work or die isn't the system that I think is best, especially if a capitalist is incentivized to get his laborers to work as much as possible in order to maximize his profits. That's going to be extremely expensive for the laborers, even in theory. And of course, that's what we've seen it be in practice.
Right. So if you could
not necessarily saying it's involuntary, I'm just saying there's a better system.
All right. But when we're looking at better systems, we must look at the ethics, the ethicality of what system is better versus what is good, what is bad. We have established our frame of logic that property rights is what we ought to protect through that train of logic being sent at the start of the debate, right? So I believe all property should be protected. It's no real distinct. I don't really believe there's distinctions in regard to property we should protect. So in regards to exploitation, if you literally concede the idea that work is voluntary, then that means that exploitation is irrelevant in debating the ethics of private property.
So, I mean, it's not irrelevant if your voluntary choices are work or starve to death. I mean, you can say technically, nobody's forcing you to go do it, but you have the choice to die. I mean, sure, technically by your choice of verbiage there, it is voluntary, but it's still the choice of have your labor exploited for somebody who's going to be making insane profits or die.
Mm-hmm. Right. Also, you literally agree with my point that we established our idea of property rights, that property rights ought to be protected, right? So
and that's where I disagree.
Which we disagree with.
It should be publicly owned because that would be better for the masses if the masses own the means of production.
It's funny because at the beginning, Ben said that
we'll get into that.
Workers.
I promise you we'll address that in 2 minutes, right? We'll get into the private versus public ownership and means of production. I'll be happy to debate that, right? So now, when talking about the ethicality of it, the property rights, you have said yourself that work is voluntary now. So it doesn't go against our ethical framework of voluntary exchanges, right? So now if we want to get into the problems of a public ownership means of production, we can. And the problems of communism, we definitely can.
I just think it was funny at the beginning of the debate. Ben said that under capitalism, you get to own the fruits of your labor, but you're literally paid a set wage to work, or a set salary. Under socialism, the profits that you help create for this public company get redistributed back to you, where you quite literally get to own the fruits of your labor.
I said you own the fruits of your labor, and you own your labor. So
because we believe in the labor theory of property, or homesteading, that we homestead property to get our labor. But if we're talking about working in terms of like companies, when we go to work, we voluntarily contractually agree, and we use the employer's capital goods to create consumer goods, right? We're not the sole producers of labor. We are part of the production process, and using our own labor in there in return for a wage. But you also have the capital goods and natural resources going into the production process, all an input to create an output. The idea that labor is like the sole determinant of this value is insane, but they also voluntarily agreed to work for it. So they are voluntarily giving, even if that's a presupposed surplus value, you are voluntarily giving your value to the person who's employing you.
Yeah, with the choice of death. But you mentioned the theory of value. Have you seen Paul Cockshot's recent video where he takes the input and output tables from all the major industry in all the major Western countries, and then he tracks how much they're producing to how much their labor, and they find that the equilibrium on the supply and demand chart essentially is 94 to 98% correlated with how much labor is put in. So even that Marxist idea that price is determined by labor, which isn't even that important to our argument, the labor theory of value holds up. And like I said,
here's a question. I have a big question for you. Is price different than value? Marx agrees with this.
Price different than value. It depends on what kind of value you're talking about.
So, like the overall value of a commodity, is it different than price? Because Marx believes value and price are separate from each other.
Right, like the use value is different.
So if price and value are different from each other, then how can we determine the labor theory of value from a price phenomenon? Because labor theory of value is based on social labor time. The individual inputs of labor applied to the outputs doesn't go along with Marx's original argument. Since price is different than value, you can't use the price to determine the value of something. As Marx himself said that value is different than price.
Yeah, there's actually a ton of contentions you can have with this argument. Like a correlation doesn't equal causation. Also, like it seems pretty natural that there would be a correlation between a valuable resource and price, right? I mean, if you looked at gold, right, you would obviously see a correlation between higher prices and higher amounts of gold. Labor is an important and valuable resource. Also, okay, so these empirical studies do not use actual labor time data to estimate labor content, but instead use monetary data from the input-output tables. So I have actually have a whole thing on that. I'm not even going to bother reading through all this because I think like the things me and Alex already said kind of like refutes that point. But like I had like a whole section in our document prepared just specifically for this argument. But like I don't even see how that proves anything.
That labor is correlated to price. That doesn't prove anything about the labor.
It doesn't prove the labor theory of value.
When Marx talks about the labor theory of value, he talks about in equilibrium, socially necessary labor determining exchange values, right? But we're not in equilibrium right now. We're never going to be in equilibrium, first off. Secondly, he distinguishes the difference between value and price, right? So your input-output to tables are measuring the input of labor in relation to the prices, but not in regards to the value based on the S and based on socially necessary labor time, which is like you can't quantify as it's heterogeneous in nature. The socially necessary labor time. I mean, you can't aggregate it all into one input. So when you talk about the input to outputs based on prices, one, you're ignoring the difference between price and value, which Marx himself distinguished, and two, you're ignoring the socially necessary labor time factor, the LTV.
So the most important part about the LTV, though, is that the capital does not maintain itself without labor, right? You can have all these discussions about labor's correlation to price, sure, and in the modern economy, there's a lot of contention about that, subjective theory of value and whatnot. But if the workers withhold their labor, the capitalist stops making money. If Jeff Bezos decides to take the day off and go golfing for the day, Amazon keeps functioning. So then you have a system where the capitalist is reliant on the workers, but the workers aren't reliant on the capitalist. This is private property in essence.
Well, it is.
The workers themselves, or the workers would have organized and said, let's take this for ourselves, unless you had a violent state to maintain private property rights. So you can have all these discussions about the labor theory of value and how it can be used to trace price. But the fact remains that labor is what creates everything we have in society, right? Hedge fund managers and stockholders do zero labor. If they went away, I mean, they're essentially parasitic, despite the fact that they have an insanely disproportionate amount of power. And this is private property. You know, this is the current system.
I'm happy you bring this up in regards to like. All right, let's talk about this actually. In regards to this idea that like the capitalist means workers, but workers don't mean capitalists. Well, we have all these different factors of production, being land, labor, capital, right? The production process is not solely made of labor. There's natural resources and capital goods involved in the production process. But the thing that puts all these capital goods together is entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurs predict future conditions through market, through capital structures, to invest and then do this on that. The entrepreneur is what puts this all together. Yeah, if you take labor out of the equation, sure, there won't be a commodity because you want to produce things. But if you take certain capital goods out of the equation, you also get messed up. You take natural resources, you get messed up. These are necessities. The actual value of a commodity is based upon actual human actions and individual actors in an economy. So individuals will see what they value, and entrepreneurs will try to predict that value on people's value, and then base prices based off of that, right? So we can't use these like cockshot input-output tables to determine labor theory of value when it's it doesn't like go along with the labor theory of value being through SNLT and through the actual distinction between value and price.
You mentioned that the entrepreneurs, the stockholders and shareholders are essential because they determine production, but that's part of our argument, is that if you allow private property and you allow these people to determine how human labor power is used to create what society needs, it's going to leave a lot of things wanting, which is why we produce enough food for everyone, but 9 million people starve to death every year. Because we don't have public ownership of what we produce, so we can't say, let's feed everyone. We can't say, let's build hospitals. Actually, I mean, that's what China did. They built hospitals in a matter of days. But I mean, during the pandemic, we've really seen the failure of private property determining production, right? We've seen an inability to. I'm
happy to talk about private versus public ownership right now. One of my favorite things of this is, in order to establish a price system, you need private property to do so, right? Without prices, you have no common unit of measurement to compare different factors of production to determine which factors of production you should employ as inputs in the production process, right? So, like, what mechanism can you employ? How can you establish a quantitative relationship based on these different factors of production to determine which to employ in the production process itself? You're saying, oh, but capitalism bad at production, these different things. Workers are on the means of production. But it does not address the main problem with it. In your system, you don't have a price system. So you have no mechanism in comparing factors of production to determine which ones go in the production process.
I mean, in the Soviet Union, for example, they used linear programming basically to calculate the inputs that they had, the amount of resources that they had. They would determine output based on previous year's demand. If it was a little low, they would increase output. If it was high, they would decrease output. They would use constraints. They would use how much land they had. They would use how much resources they had. And they would use how much labor they had. They would be able to distribute resources effectively to create these goods. So in the Soviet Union, they were able to create their 10,000 best selling commodidies using linear programming, which I will admit, they had hundreds of thousands of commodities that they were not able to use. They also did this with pen and paper, and were still able to very accurately guess the price equilibrium that these goods would be selling at.
So in the Soviet Union and other Soviet bloc countries, first of all, they utilized Western prices. They looked at other Western countries for prices. So, I mean, there is that. But also, allocation losses in the Soviet Union were 3 to 10%, right? They weren't efficient. They weren't productively efficient at all. In fact, they were very bad in productive efficiency.
Right.
Let me see. The use of raw materials and energy production of each
and a lot of this
product
is also due to corruption, where the owners of factories would lobby the government to keep their factory open even if they weren't being productive. like Eddie said, we're not going to shy away and say like, oh, this isn't real socialism. Like the Soviet Union was a socialist experiment. It didn't work because, again, the corruption, and it was the first socialist experiment. And
right. So
and this idea that you can't allocate resources correctly, I mean, one, we're going to need a team of scientists and engineers if we're going to create any kind of mode of production that's sustainable with the environment in the 21st century. And then two, the only country who increased their production and GDP during the pandemic was China, who has the vast majority of their banks and their major industry are nationalized, are centrally planned. And yes, they use Western prices, sure, but like we're saying, we aren't trying to jump to socialism, this system with no money, communism, this system with no money and private property rights tomorrow, right? It's a transition. Yeah. And the first step in that transition is to seize the oil industry and put a team of scientists behind the production of the energy sector, which you can determine, how do we get energy to places who need it through linear programming and computers, as Paul Cockshott again has talked about in his lecture on whatever it's called, cyber socialism. And then I guess that's all I had to say. Oh yeah, and then eventually you want to get to a system, where there's no money at all. I mean, that's the communist goal. But it happens slowly, and to act like nationalizing these major banks and industry, which is what Matt and I advocate for, all of a sudden you're going to be totally unable to handle production and determine how to do production. I mean, China proves that false. They kicked the U.S.'s ass during COVID.
As far as the USSR, I think it's. Do you want to go, Alex, or do you want me to finish my points on the USSR?
All right, so when we talk about COVID. Like by what metric? In COVID deaths or what? But we're talking about actual production plans.
They're the only country whose GDP went up. So even by like the metric of what makes a good economy, to usually what capitalists measure, China's the only country who had their GDP increase.
I mean,
GDP is irrelevant to me. I don't care. GDP is
okay. Well, they had very few deaths, and they alleviated poverty the year we had. They brought their 1.4 billion person out of poverty. The year we had a global pandemic, as the U.S. is in the tank, letting these billionaires and financial oligarchs determine how production's carried out. Instead of building hospitals, we fucking just have let our people die.
All right. So 1, China has prices. 2, China has a market. 3, China has private property. Right. There are 3 conditions that China has that by my argument would be irrelevant too. So that's one thing. Secondly, when we're talking about with this and the other things, linear and the rest of linear programming. Linear programming is a thing that only works in static economies in terms of linear. But economies are ever changing. They're ever in disequilibrium. They're always going to change. Never going to be static. We're in a dynamic economy. We're always living in a dynamic economy. I don't know how about that linear programming. It could tell us how much. Linear programming could tell us how using so much more of X instead of Y would affect output, but it cannot tell us whether we should use X or Y, which is the point of my argument. How do we determine which facts of production to employ in the production process? There's so many different facts of production we could use in the production process, and there's so many different things that we are going to use. And then from this, in a capitalist system, we have entrepreneurs who use the price system and facts of production to employ facts of production in the production process, right? So in socialism, or in communism, you have no money, you have no private property, so you have no way of establishing a common unit of measurement between these facts of production to determine which ones to employ in the production process.
I mean, that's never existed before a moneyless, stateless, classless society. So, it comes back to this argument: we want to transition out of the current system into the next one. So all your preconditions that you say are needed for production, that's what exists right now. Maybe
that's needed for prices, not production. But in regards to prices, we need to have a price system.
We'll finish.
So in terms of prices, we need a price system to create a quantitative relationship with a common unit of measurement between factors of production. If we don't have that, we can't determine what to input in the production process. And I can even empirically prove this. The Soviet Union in 1920 abolished their currency and immediately flopped and had to go right back into money.
Right, because they're trying to build socialism in a world economy that's dominated by, production related to prices. Did you have something to say, Matt?
No, I mean, in like Eddie keeps saying, we're talking about like a transition from capitalism to socialism to communism. So again, we wouldn't get rid of prices right away. We wouldn't get rid of money right away. It's a transition to get to this.
Once it happens, right? Economies are ever changing. So you can't use previous conditions from years ago to use in modern economies, right? You're eventually going to run into that point where you're going to get messed up and won't be able to properly produce different things because you lack a common denominator to compare production.
We're saying who determines how production should change and develop is the masses, right? You have a team of scientists and engineers and programmers who are deciding how production is carried out. So you have a global pandemic and they go, oh, we need to put more production into masks and hospitals, rather than, allowing whoever owns the means of production to determine production, which in the US we've seen them say, don't stay home from work. You can't stay home from work. You got to keep working to make sure the system maintains itself. And eventually you could totally move out of a system, where prices are irrelevant. When you have vast material abundance.
Eddie, I have several points on what you've brought up about China. Now, first of all, I don't think COVID deaths actually reflect on whether or not a country is good at allocating productive resources. Also, as Alex pointed out, China isn't a communist country. Of course, they do utilize central planning, as does the U.S., especially, as you mentioned, hospitals in the U.S. essentially is done through central planning. You can't just go and plant a hospital. You can't just go and plant a medical center wherever you want. You have to go through the government to do that, and it's often very difficult. So if anything, that right there kind of proves our point. Also, as even if China's COVID deaths proved anything, I don't think I can even remotely trust the numbers coming out of China. And I've got several notes on this. First of all, there were several times when China had to change numbers of cities. COVID deaths, like in Wuhan at one point, they added 50%, a 50% increase in deaths in one day. Once some American scientists pointed out that their numbers weren't accurate. Also, if you go through data on crematories in Wuhan and other cities, you can see that it completely doesn't add up with how many deaths they said there was. You can look at the data on how long they were running and how many bodies they actually burn. And you can see there was way more dead bodies than they reported. And I can send you this stuff later if you want. Okay. Also, as far as the actual allocation of productive resources, China failed miserably on COVID. They sent out masks and other equipment which were defective or infected already. They were infecting people in other countries with the resources they were sending out. Whereas in the US, you had companies like Tesla, Ford, GM, et cetera. You had breweries making hand sanitizer. You had all these companies making masks, sending them all over the place. The productive allocation in the U.S. was immaculate, and the allocation of productive resources in China was absolutely horrible. So you bringing up this point, if you actually look at the facts, this entirely backs up our point. And then you even mentioned poverty. China utilized the liberalization of their economy to attack poverty.
It is insane to me in the U.S. that, we can look at a country that had 4,600 COVID deaths and they have a much larger population than ours. And we have 400,000 COVID deaths and our economy's in the tanks while they were the only country in the world whose GDP increased. And there's still people in the U.S. who just go, oh no, they are the ones who had it all wrong. They must just be lying about the numbers.
You can prove they lied about the numbers. I can give you the data. Do you want me to go? Do you want me to go over it right now and do the math right in front of you?
The other thing is, this point was irrelevant to Eddie's earlier point. He was talking about the economy, not COVID deaths. But the other thing is, it didn't really matter how great our productive resources were allocated because it didn't help. Right? We didn't get masks to people who needed it. Trump scratched a plan to send 3 COVID masks to every single person in the country, effectively increasing non-mask wearage.
The government greatly interfered in the allocation of resources. I'm not going to argue with that, and I'm completely against that. Of course,
the government saying you can't build a hospital in a certain place is not an example of central planning. That would, if the government had full control over the medical industry, and then they decided where, you know, the resources from the medical industry are allocated. That's central planning. It's not central planning when the U.S. says don't build hospitals in rural areas because it's not possible.
That's a failure of the profit motive of capitalism. That's not a failure of central planning.
You know what the problem is in that scenario, that U.S. government didn't allow people to build hospitals? It's a problem of not respecting property rights. If property rights were respected, people would be allowed to build hospitals wherever they please, as long as it was on their own property.
Well, when you had that in Cuba, when property rights were respected and it was essentially everything was allowed, there were no hospitals in the Escambray. In the areas where the rural peasants were living, there were no hospitals, and there were full private property rights. The plantation owners had full control, and they didn't, you know, and you can read about it in Che's motorcycle diaries. He's traveling across Latin America and watching people die. Because there's no hospitals built for the peasants in the rural areas. And that's a problem in America too, is, you know, because it's not profitable. So if you have this market system, the idea that capitalists out of the goodness of their own heart are just going to build hospitals everywhere where people need them is ridiculous. They're going to put them in the cities where there's people who are going to pay to use the hospital.
Okay, right. And here's the thing. Wait. So when in Cuban history did they have the protection of property rights?
Under Batista.
I was saying under
Batista, the person who had slavery under his regime.
The plantation owners had slaves.
Right.
That was their property rights. All he was just
property rights. At the start.
Okay. Sure.
Again, as long as there's state property rights cannot coexist.
Well, how under your system do you think capitalists are gonna put hospitals in rural areas where there's nobody who's going to go, but they still need them?
Entrepreneur, like even in like a small rural.
Entrepreneurs will do it.
Okay, this is also the problem of investing in lower income areas too. Lower income areas that are mostly occupied by people of color. In lower income areas, there's not as much investment because entrepreneurs know they're not going to get as much business there. That's a problem of entrepreneurship. That's a problem of not putting hospitals in these areas. That's a problem of again, just a lack of investment in lower income communities.
Okay, let me explain it like this. Okay, what happens when people are stuck at home, when people are dying, when people are getting sick and they can't go to work and our economy fails? What happens to the rich people? They fail too. Everyone fails because in an economy, everyone is connected, right? So it is completely in the entrepreneur's best interest to help people. And exactly, I gave you several examples earlier of companies producing these resources and giving them out for free in order to help people, right? And there are so many companies, like my own bank, right? They called me several times and they're like, are you having any trouble with paying your car insurance bills? We'll help you if you have any trouble. They weren't required to do that by law, but they do that because, number one, I mean, people help people out of the goodness of their own hearts. Number two, that helps you keep consumers for the future. Number three, that helps you keep the economy going and not failing, because if it fails, then you are going to fail too. And yes, right. People will put out medical resources. People will help people, but that was greatly restricted by our own U.S. government. But even then, we still saw a lot of great successes, like I already pointed out.
Right. The U.S. took the dumbest way possible. They shut people down, and then they also didn't give people economic help to spend money in small businesses in their communities. They didn't issue a mask mandate to keep people safe in order to frequent businesses within their area.
And you're pointing out how businesses gave stuff away for free. I mean,
that's a great anecdote.
Charity doesn't work. I mean, 400,000 people died, even though businesses were trying to give people stuff for free, because they still needed those people in the workplaces to continue their profit because of private property, to continue expanding their profit. So people died because they caught COVID at work. And now we have the most COVID deaths of any country.
Look at the private business.
It doesn't work.
Look at Tyson Chicken. In my home state of Iowa, we had 1,300 workers at Tyson Chicken. Tyson, not wanting to lose out on profit, kept their workers coming in. They had 1,100 workers out of their 1,300 workers get infected with COVID. They had something like 70 deaths because this private company didn't want to shut down, didn't want to make sure that these people were safe. They'd rather work at the profit motive. That, again, shows that, not everybody's going to do stuff out of the goodness of their heart. Some people are motivated by greed. Some people are motivated by money. Do
you guys want to respond to that? And then can we table this for later? I really got to... I'm sorry, I got to work, but we can
if you want me to respond to that, if you want me to respond to that exact point, then I don't see how you're saying the company kept people coming. I mean, people went to work because they wanted to keep working. Because I mean that
no,
not all companies.
The alternative is death. Yeah.
Yeah. Not. I mean, yeah.
Right. I mean,
yes.
I could have stopped paying my rent.
You could have had the government step up, pay people. You know, that's what they did in Canada. They had nationalized wages. They did that in Germany. You keep people home because we're in a global pandemic. You keep people home because we're in a global pandemic.
Okay, number one, paying people from the government doesn't actually keep the economy going, so that doesn't really make sense.
It would have paid my rent.
That's why consumer spending went up 17% in quarter two.
Even assuming you're right there, right? There's still many other issues you have to deal with. Like you have to deal with the excess deaths from depression and just being at home. Even if you are being paid, being unemployed increases your chance of death by 80%, just like as a human being by 80%, right? And it greatly decreases your lifespan. Also, people weren't able to go to important doctors' meetings. Like you have to realize COVID deaths aren't the only deaths we're dealing with in the pandemic. There are tons of excess deaths. Just in the United Kingdom, they were going to have as many deaths just from heart attacks as they had from COVID, just because they had to close out people from getting to vital doctors' meetings, right?
Okay, but that doesn't disprove that making people go to work caused them to catch COVID at work.
I mean, they didn't make people go to work. People went to work because...
Yes, I'm sorry. I could have not gone to work the entire pandemic and I would be living on the streets. That's a much more, a much better option when you have a global pandemic.
Eddie, earlier in the debate, you conceded that work is voluntary.
Yes, voluntary. Okay, so it's voluntary, or I could lose my house and die. So in a pandemic, a system that gives you the choice between go to work and possibly die of deadly illness or go live on the streets is not a good system. You should have a system of public ownership that takes care of people until the pandemic's done.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba's economy failed even worse than ours. So I mean,
Cuba has like 80 COVID deaths.
No, they had significantly more COVID cases than that. I actually have notes on Cuba as well and how their numbers are inaccurate. If you want me to go over that as well,
they're all inaccurate. Everyone,
yeah, absolutely.
Anyone that disproves your argument that forcing people to go to work in a pandemic, those are all inaccurate. They all lied.
I mean, yeah, unironically, yes.
Right, and there's no Western media hegemony either. The Western media is not trying to pitch any kind of narrative.
No, I didn't go through Western media. I did my own. Like, I mean, Western media doesn't agree with me and Alex's points on this. Like, I mean, they supported lockdowns and stuff like that. Like, I'm talking about you have to realize there's things like excess deaths, there's things like economic ruin, which ultimately can cause even worse conditions for people than a virus.
And the U.S. is doing the worst. And all those places where you would measure how people handle the pandemic, the U.S. has the most deaths, and our economy's in the tanks. And your only refutation to that is every other country lied about their deaths. Or
look at.
I mean, I didn't
Europe.
say that.
Europe nationalized their wages. They kept people at home. They mitigated the spread. They mandated masks.
All right, one more, please. I'll let you guys have the last word, please. And then I really got to go to bed, and we can do the economics argument in a week or something.
Let me just go on like a 2-minute thing on all the points.
Please.
The question originally started, and my question has still not been answered, on how can we establish an objective link between these different factors of production with a common denominator to determine inputs in the production process. You guys immediately went and said, oh, look at China, look at COVID, look at the USSR. Again, I showed 1920 USSR, they lost money, immediately failed, and then they get to reestablish it instantly.
We already said we're not for abolishing prices right now. It's a transition. We have a transition in mind.
Right now, in the end, the topic of this debate is communism versus capitalism. Communism is moneyless. Even if you have money now, when you achieve your communist society, you get rid of money. Economies are dynamic and in disequilibrium. They are never in equilibrium. If we had a static equilibrium for the whole time, sure, I'd agree with you that's irrelevant. But since we're always in a disequilibrium and our economy is dynamic and ever changing,
right, and it's inefficient,
capital values ever changing, then we can't use previous conditions from the price system and transition it over to the current system. So once you abolish money, you still need some way to establish an objective link between facts of production to determine inputs. And also, you're saying how America's economy went down on these different things, but That was because of the lockdowns, right? The Fed's policy in response to COVID and the government's overall economic response was not good. You guys said,
Right.
oh, we should have fiscal spending. We had small little bits, but I disagree with the overall idea of fiscal stimulus. I think it'd be something like short-term gain for long-term pain.
Yeah, and it's just not realistic to just stop a country's production. I mean, that's pretty vital to keep people alive as well. I mean, I completely recognize the dangers of COVID and the people who died from it. But again, I'm saying just focusing on one aspect of that is very dangerous. Like, I mean, again, like I pointed out, as many deaths from heart attacks because of the lockdown. That's just one cause. As many deaths as COVID deaths in the UK also, because of lockdowns.
One more thing on top. So you guys are saying, oh, we have to work during COVID to like maintain ourselves. So do you guys propose that everyone just stops working under communism under a pandemic, or what? Because these people still need to produce different things. People will still have to work even in a pandemic in your ideal system. Because if you don't, everyone's going to die from no production.
So we're saying mask mandate.
And we're saying it shouldn't be like prices, right? So this happened all over the place, and there were multiple people who sued the FDA because they were going to meatpacking companies and they weren't catching COVID because their bosses weren't enforcing any protections. You have people go to work, but you have strict protections enforced. You got to be 6 feet away. You got to have PPE. And if your employer can't provide you with PPE, you don't go to work. And then when you manage production, you build hospitals in the places where the breakout was the worst. I mean, that's what China did. They built a series of hospitals in 5 days. And that's what the U.S. had the inability to do because, you know, a system of private ownership doesn't have anything to say when there's a pandemic, right? If it doesn't stop profits, they don't care. And if they sell an extra, you know, body bag, that ups the GDP and that's good. For their sales, what our systems incentivize. We're saying if you have things publicly owned, you know, they function like schools or whatever else, you can manage how production is carried out, including the production of your essential industries, things like meatpacking that being said can't go away, that you need to maintain society. You know, if it's publicly owned, you can do it in a safe way. If it's privately owned, the capitalist is going to pack you on the meatpacking line because he doesn't give a shit if you get COVID. Right. He'll just go hire someone else.
Do you understand how profits work? You're saying, oh, we're not going to do it if it's profitable. What is profitable is what is at the demand of the consumers, right? This is like, I see a lot of Marxists do this in general in the debates in like regards to markets and profit motives. They argue that capitalists or entrepreneurs will produce different things, and from that, they're gonna like people are gonna have to buy from them and go work for them. No, it's not how it works. Entrepreneurs have to gouge the demand of the consumers and then adjust to those demands.
I'm not even talking. I was talking about the laborers though, who work for them. I wasn't even talking about consumers. I was saying production is carried out so that they can make it profitable to consumers, which means putting people side by side on meatpacking lines in a global pandemic cause them to catch labor. Also, I mean, yeah, that's great for consumers, but now people are dead.
Yeah, when labor happens, like people who do labor is also making some form of profit. All voluntary exchanges are mutually beneficial. All action is to achieve a higher valued end and to achieve a higher state of affairs than before. So humans apply means to achieve ends, and my means will be like, oh, I'll employ labor to make money. My means is labor, my end is to create money.
So because you believe voluntary exchanges to be good in the abstract, if I make the voluntary exchange to go to work on a meatpacking plant and I catch COVID and die, that's just good because it was voluntary?
Well, in terms of but I'm saying that if you were going to work at that point, that is better than all the options you could do. This is an a priori true statement based on praxeology. But in regards to in regards to normative ethics, earlier in the debate we established our idea of the NAP. The conclusion of the NAP is to have non-aggression on people's property. So from there we can deduce my system and my idea of voluntary exchanges.
All right.
And by the way, having your workers catch COVID is not profitable. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah. So John,
right. That's why
that's why you need the reserve army of unemployed people. So they can if a worker gets COVID, it's papa, you're fired. No union for you. The state crushed your union laws. I'll just go hire some other guy. Also, I really gotta go to bed.
But you don't believe in a state.
I know. There's one day we'll have this world with no state, and everyone will just get along. Let's do. You guys want to do the economics argument some other time?
We could do it on art.
No, John, shut up.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of went into some of it that time, but I mean, there was plenty of more It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah. Okay. I do appreciate talking to you guys, and I appreciate that you clarified some things for me, because I was reading what did I read? I read the New Libertarian Manifesto, and I was a little confused at some points about what you guys actually believe. So it was nice to clarify.
Yeah, and if you want, I can send you some of the various sources I mentioned on, Cuba, China, whatever.
One more thing. What are you like? I know you're a voluntarist, Alex, but Ben, what are you now?
Yeah, I'm the same thing. Volunteers.
Voluntarian. Is that different from agorist?
Agorism is a form of left market anarchy, in which it has like specific ways of achieving in society. It is compatible with voluntarism. Voluntarism is just someone who abides by the voluntary principle and property rights that everything should be voluntary.
Okay, gotcha. I read I can't remember the guy's name, but it was about agorism. All right, well, I'm out. I appreciate you guys. Thanks for having. Oh, can I upload this on my YouTube too once it's up?
Yeah,
for sure. All right, we'll see you later.